Welcome to the IRS Solution Attorney Show. If you have problems with the IRS, don't focus on the negative, focus on the solutions. With the IRS Solution Attorney, Darrin T. Mish. For over 15 years, he's been helping taxpayers with IRS problems reclaim their lives and their financial stability. Now, here's your host of the IRS Solution Attorney Show, Darrin T. Mish.
Well, good morning and welcome. You're listening to the IRS Solution Attorney Show
with your host, the IRS Solution Attorney, Darrin T. Mish.
And I'm your co-host, Katrina Madewell. Thank you for joining us today. This show, I'm kind of excited about this one because we've been talking about this for a long while, and now we're finally doing the show.
Yeah, the last few weeks we've been talking about kind of softer stuff, not quite as useful if you actually have a tax problem. But today we're going to talk about what are your rights as a taxpayer. And
we've been talking about that for a long time because here and there we'll mention the Taxpayer Advocate Service, right?
A lot of people think, what are my rights as a taxpayer? I got no rights. You know, the IRS is going to come down and hammer me if they say I've done something wrong and you don't really have any rights and it just is the way it is. And today's show is all about how that's not actually true. And you have certain enumerated rights that they go through at length, and we're going to have some comments on what they are and what that means.
So let's start with the first one, which is the right to be informed.
So taxpayers have the right to know what they need to do in order to comply with the tax laws. They're entitled to clear explanations of the laws and IRS procedures in all tax forms, instructions, publications, notices, and correspondence. They have the right to be informed of IRS decisions about their tax accounts and to receive clear explanations of the outcomes.
Which that can be tricky just in itself.
Now, this is kind of funny. You have the right to be informed. Okay. I guess the way the IRS is interpreting that at this point in time is your right to be informed is being covered primarily by getting notices. You know, this is how much you owe. Now, I think they violate this right quite a bit, and I'm not sure systemically how to fix it because
we've informed you.
The IRS notices are so hard to understand if you're a layperson, and they have been since I've been doing this work for getting close to 20 years now.
And they don't even name the notice. It's like CP 1000, right? It's all.
Well, they name them like that, but you wouldn't believe how many notices we get where there's just a balance due and it doesn't even reference a tax period. You know, it's just like you owe us $5,211.92, and then you flip it over to see, okay, for what tax year, and it's like gone. You know,
you can't even tell.
Or whatever. Or sometimes we get notices where it'll say this is for tax year 2011, and there'll be an asterisk. Not an amount due, but an asterisk.
What does that mean? You don't know either. That's lovely.
What I think it means is there's a tax balance due that was not calculatable at the time that the notice was generated. And so you're supposed to call to find out how much you owe.
You should at least put a TBD, don't you think?
Yeah, what's happening is as the IRS tries to become more automated, they're falling short. And that's because Congress honestly won't fund them adequately.
It means you also have the right to be informed about your decisions, right? You see this one a lot.
Yeah.
Do they send it to you too as their attorney or only to them?
Yeah, they actually ask me every single time I get on the phone with a new IRS employee about a new matter. They ask me if my client has received a Publication 1, which kind of one of the things that we're doing right here today is we're kind of going over Publication 1 and talking about what your rights are as a taxpayer. And you can even hear in the language that we're using that it's not terribly easy to understand.
And the next one is almost laughable because they say the right to quality service. What does that mean?
You have the right to quality service as a taxpayer. So taxpayers have the right to receive prompt, courteous, professional assistance in their dealings with the IRS, to be spoken to in a way that can be easily understood, to receive clear and easily understandable communications from the IRS, and to speak to a supervisor about inadequate service.
Well, they should be able to revamp that whole thing.
So I often make jokes about they shouldn't call it the Internal Revenue Service because there's not a whole lot of service going on. A number of years ago, so there's taxpayer assistance centers all across the country. They're actually called that. IRS offices are called primarily taxpayer assistance centers. And so there's one in Tampa. There's one in St. Petersburg that we're sitting pretty close to actually here at the studio.
Don't throw away.
And there's one in Lakeland, and they're all over the place. Okay, so a number of years ago, perhaps 10 now, the IRS put out a memorandum. It was around this time of the year actually, and I'll never forget this memo because it said, in the interest of providing better customer service, taxpayers will no longer be able to walk into taxpayer assistance centers and receive service. Taxpayers will now be required to call the toll-free numbers to receive service.
How is that in the interest of better customer
Well, it's like
service?
Alice in Wonderland. That's what I always say about the IRS. It's like, it's bizarro world here, is that you're going to call these toll-free numbers with 2 and 3 hour waits to receive better customer service. Right now, if you call those toll-free numbers at certain times of the year, if you got on the phone at 9 a.m., you could be on the phone literally all day and hung up on before
at the end of the day.
At the end of the day. That could happen.
And you know this because you probably experienced it.
Yeah, we have a little different system in the office now than we had for years. For years, I would sit on hold doing other work, just waiting for them to come on the line, and then they'd hang up on you without ever getting to talk to somebody.
Why? Because it's 5 o'clock,
or because it just times out. There's like a predetermined, nobody can wait longer than 3 hours because it screws up our stats or something. And so it literally says, there's some recording that says something like, sorry, the wait time's been so long, we can't help you, click.
If you'd like to make a call.
And so you can imagine that, okay, if you're a taxpayer and you owe the IRS money, okay, this is probably like a once-in-a-lifetime thing, okay? Now, some people owe taxes for 10 or 20 years, and it might go on for a really long time. But this is my job, and I don't have one taxpayer. I've got a lot of taxpayers. And so it makes my blood pressure go up if I have to wait on hold with the IRS. So we have other staff that helps me. They wait on hold, and then they connect me when the phone actually goes through. We do a lot of things not by phone, especially at the first level, if we can help it. Because
have they progressed to email yet, or no? It's all in writing.
The IRS has internal email, but
I mean, you can't email them.
But you cannot email them.
That's what I thought.
But now get this. This is
Can
great.
you imagine what a debacle that would be?
Listen to this. This is great. They do fax because they consider fax to be more secure than email. Okay, I sort of get it, I guess. But they use eFax, which goes over the internet.
Same thing.
And I found out yesterday, talking to a revenue officer on the phone, that they actually use voice over IP, which also goes over the internet. So it's sort of interesting. They're all worried about security. I think they should be, but they're using the internet that I think is, I don't know, I'm speculating, hackable, especially the phone calls.
Oh, I'm sure. All of it. I mean, really. Anyway. But I just think it's interesting that there's no paper trail on their end. Like there's no accountability for email. Anyway.
So the next right that you have as a taxpayer is also sort of interesting. The right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax. I think inherently we could all agree that that's a great aspiration, right?
What do they consider the correct amount of tax?
Well, here's what the explanation says. It says taxpayers have the right to pay only the amount of tax legally due, including interest and penalties. I hate that part.
Oh, including interest
and to have the
penalties.
IRS apply all tax payments properly. So let me tell you,
just strike through that interest.
So
and
let me tell you,
part.
let me tell you a little vignette about a personal problem that I had with the IRS in the last few months. I have now a pretty much defunct corporation, and it had to pay a penalty for late filing of a return or something. It was like $200, and I make the payment out for $200, and for some reason I write the EIN on the check, but I don't put the coupon with it. I don't know. I was probably mad when I was writing the check. So I put it in the envelope and I mail it to the IRS. Well, it doesn't get applied to my account. It just disappears. Now it's only $200, right? So it's not like the end of the world. But to me, it was the principle of the thing. It's like, I'll be damned if I'm going to pay you another $200. Y'all need to find this money and put it on my account. And so what they do in these situations is they say, well, give us a copy of the back of the check, and that'll have all of our internal coding on it, and then we'll be able to figure out where we misapplied the money. Okay? So I give them a copy of the back of the check. And then here's what I get. We can't read the numbers on the back of the check. And again, it kind of, you're making a face like,
you want me to fix that how?
And so I had to go to great lengths to blow the back of the check up and like to clean up all the noise and stuff so they could read the numbers so that they could properly apply my tax payment. Now, I actually think that they were violating my right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax because they wanted the $200 twice. But I had to go through, you wouldn't believe how much trouble I had to go through to get that properly applied. I had to involve the taxpayer advocate, who spent, I don't know how many hours on this. They had to track it down, take it from the wrong taxpayer, put it on my account, all over $200. I actually come to think of it, I filed a collection due process hearing on that case. I filed an appeal on that case over the $200 because I was so bad.
I can only imagine how much that person got paid per hour and how long it took them to actually track that down, all of the $200.
I guarantee it cost the government more than $200 to conduct that hearing, which ultimately the settlement officer told me to get lost, that it wasn't his job. But and I hadn't read this in a while, but right there it is in black and white. Right number 3, the right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax. I should have said that. That's what I'm saying in the next hearing.
Just going to bring in that snippet of the tax code and go, this is what it is.
Well, it's not really a tax code. It's their internal publication, but, nonetheless.
Yeah, their book.
So number 4 is the right to challenge the IRS's position and be heard.
And that's exactly where you come in, but we're going to have to wait to talk about the IRS's, the right to challenge them and have that position be heard. And that's how Darrin can help you. You can get him at 888-GET-MISH.
Or at getirshelp.com. It's 888-GET-MISH, which is 888-438-6474.
All right, stick around when we come back. We're going to talk about the right to challenge the IRS. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back. You're listening to the IRS Solution Attorney Show.
With the IRS Solution Attorney, Darrin T. Mish.
And I'm your co-host, Katrina Madewell, and I cut you off right at the right time. That was pretty good. I know you're ready to dive into that one. I'm like, whoa, hold the phone.
So today we're talking about your rights as a taxpayer, and we had gotten to right number 4. But before we talk about that, let's go over the first 3 real quick. You have the right to be informed by the IRS. So you have the right to understand their notices and stuff. I think that is routinely violated. Number 2, you have the right to quality service. Well, that is without a doubt routinely violated, but you do have that right to quality service.
I don't have souls.
Here's what's interesting about that. It says the right to quality service. It doesn't say high quality service. It says quality service. So it could be poor quality service.
Depends on what your standards of quality are.
Exactly. You have the right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax. And I told a little story about how my $200 that I sent into the IRS got lost for about 6 months, and I made them spend about $500 or $1,000 finding my $200. And that brings us to right number 4, where we have the right to challenge the IRS's position and be heard. So here's what the publication says. It says the taxpayers have the right to raise objections and provide additional documentation in response to formal IRS actions or proposed actions, to expect that the IRS will consider their timely objections and documentation promptly and fairly, and to receive a response if the IRS does not agree with their position.
All right, so in lay terms, the right to challenge the IRS's position and be heard. How so? Since you can't go into the IRS office anymore.
There is a provision of the U.S. Constitution. It's in the Constitution in a couple places called due process. So as U.S. citizens and residents, we have the right to due process when we have disputes. Due process means you have the right to be heard, you have the right to object. So the government essentially cannot just unilaterally say, in this case, you owe us $5,000 and you don't have any, you can't argue about it. You just have to give us the money. So there's mechanisms within the law and within the code to challenge those positions. I'll give you some examples. Would be like to file appeals. Okay. So if you're going to undergo an audit and you can't come to an agreement with the auditor, you have a right to file a protest and you have a right to have an appeal. And if that doesn't work, you have the right to go to tax court, where you have a court will actually listen to what your grievances are, and the court will decide if you owe the money or not.
When would somebody actually go that far that they decide to appeal it and then actually take it to court? Like, what's an example when someone would take it that far?
If you had big money, let's say you're a real estate agent and you've got...
of course you're a real estate agent.
Because real estate agents are so good at filing and paying their taxes on time. And they're really good record keepers, too.
Well, you know.
So let's just say you're a real estate agent and you got $100,000 in mileage deduction. Okay. I think yours is probably pretty high.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
You don't have to give me a number, but you drive a lot.
3,000 miles a month.
Which is why you drive that silly little car. But,
yep.
Let's say you got $100,000 in mileage deductions and you get audited and the auditor says, well, give me your mileage log to prove up what you claimed on your return. And you're like, what mileage log?
Yeah, they're not going to like that very much.
So the auditor is going to try and disallow all of your mileage. You're going to say, no, I mean, my mileage log fell out of the car one day and I lost it. Okay.
I had the top down of my convertible and it flew out.
And so there's actually a case called Cohen, where if you're in an industry that by definition is going to have that type of deduction, you're allowed to estimate what that is, and you're supposed to be given the deduction. Now, mileage is a little bit of an exception, but let's ignore that for a second. And because obviously a real estate agent that's showing properties is going to have mileage, right? And so if the auditor tried to disallow all of it, then you would obviously want to dispute that. And then let's say you lost in the audit appeal because appeals didn't like your whatever. So then you can before, people don't know this, but before the IRS can assess that tax against you, you either have to agree to it, which is what happens when you sign a tax return. You're agreeing to the assessment of the tax on the return. You either have to agree to it, or you have to be given something called a notice of deficiency, which is like a new notice. Hey, you owe us this money unless you file a tax court case. And if you don't file a tax court case, then you owe the money. Like, you sort of lost your opportunity to complain. Now, you still have more opportunities, but you would lost the tax court opportunity. And then if you filed a tax court petition, eventually in a year or two, you'd end up in front of a tax court judge who would listen to all the facts and circumstances relating to that tax year and what kind of business you were doing. You could call witnesses and you could introduce other evidence to show, no, I showed,
I was with Mr. and Mrs. Jones.
Yeah, I showed 57 houses a month.
We wrote 9 contracts.
Yeah. I know you guys work really hard because I looked at a lot of houses in the short time that I was looking at houses, and somebody paid a whole lot of gas for that deal. But anyway, that would be an example of how it might make sense to go to tax court, because you have these big deductions that aren't being allowed at all, and so there's a lot of money at stake.
Yeah, that would make sense. So what about the right to appeal an IRS decision as an independent forum? We talked about this.
Yeah, so it says that the right to appeal an IRS decision in an independent forum. So taxpayers are entitled to a fair and impartial administrative appeal of most IRS decisions, including many penalties, and have the right to receive a written response regarding the Office of Appeals decision. Taxpayers generally have the right to take their cases to court. Okay. So here's what it means. This is true, that you can pretty much appeal most things that the IRS does. There's some exceptions. It used to be better. They've kind of cut down. We used to be able to literally appeal everything they did, which is really cool because.
But wait, you just said I have the right to appeal it, and now you're telling me I don't?
You only have the right to appeal most decisions that they make, not every decision they make.
Are they kind of breaking their own rules?
Yeah, several years ago, you could appeal everything they did, and now they've limited it somewhat. But the most popular appeals would be, if you get a final notice of intent to levy, where they're talking about seizing your property or your paycheck or your bank account, you can appeal that before it happens. If you get a federal tax lien filed against you, you can appeal that. Now, that's weird because a federal tax lien...
you don't owe it or what?
The federal tax lien gets filed, so like the damage is done, and then you get to appeal it. I don't really agree with that, but that's how it works. If you actually have a levy, you can appeal that. If you're dealing with if you have an installment agreement that's you propose an installment agreement and that's denied, you can appeal that. If you have an offer in compromise that's rejected, you can appeal that. Most of these things, despite what this publication says, you don't have the right to go to court. I mean, some of them you do and some of them you don't, but it's so expensive to litigate these matters in a traditional court, like a federal court, that.
Oh, you cut off. I don't know what happened there, Dan. You said most of the time.
Most of the time, it's so expensive to litigate these things in federal court that it's not really a right that you have. I mean, if you have a dispute with the IRS over $2,700,
you're not going to spend $15,000.
You're not going to spend $50,000 to go to court to fight over it just because it doesn't make economic sense. But these appeals to just the IRS Office of Appeals are free, and so that's not a real expensive venue.
So this is probably a term most people are not familiar with, because I am not, even though we've done the show a lot, the right to finality.
So you've never heard of finality? That sounds like a law school word for sure. The funny thing about law school is when you first start, I mean, you've got a bachelor's degree, right? But the vocabulary is so vast that literally, this is kind of pre-internet, so I'm dating myself, but literally I had a Black's Law dictionary that I used to have to carry around in my backpack that was at least 6 inches thick because there's so many new words that I had to look. You can't even just read the stuff. You were looking at the dictionary constantly.
To try to read the paragraph.
New vocabulary. So the right to finality means that the taxpayers have the right to know the maximum amount of time they have to challenge the IRS's position, as well as the maximum of time the IRS has to audit a particular tax year or collect a tax debt. Taxpayers have the right to know when the IRS has finished an audit. So
it's all about time.
This really deals with audits mostly. Now, the funny thing is this kind of goes back to the right to be informed, right? I mean, this stuff's supposed to be simple.
Right.
But it's not simple. It's not simple because in most cases you're going to need either an accountant or a lawyer to explain this stuff because I guess theoretically you could read the publications, but it's like 2-point type full of.
I think it would probably knock most people out. It'd be like bedtime reading material for sure.
Yeah, it's full of full of complex language and that kind of thing. And so most people, are not going to understand what's going on too much.
So the next one, which we see absolutely everywhere, but it's the right to privacy.
So taxpayers have the right to expect that any IRS inquiry, examination, or enforcement action will comply with the law and be no more intrusive than necessary, and will respect all due process rights, including search and seizure protections, and will provide, where applicable, a collection due process hearing. All right, so let's unpack that.
Yeah, for
sure.
Right
to privacy. Basically, the IRS is not allowed to release your private information to anyone else. Okay? Your spouse, if you file a joint return, they can release that, but that's only because it's their spouse's tax information too. Right. Right? Now, there are some exceptions. So if there's a revenue officer and he's trying to find you, and he can go to your last known address, and he can make contact with somebody who answers the door and say, "Hey, I'm looking for Katrina Madewell. I'm from the IRS. You know where she is." Now, that doesn't really disclose anything about your particular tax situation, but it's kind of a clue you might have a problem.
Doesn't sound very private to me.
Yeah, it might be a clue that you might have a problem, but they're allowed to do that to facilitate their duties to track you down and find you. It also talks about due process rights, like we talked about in an earlier segment of the show. So there's all kinds of fundamental constitutional protections that they can't violate.
Gotcha. So we've got a few more of these to go through. Let's take another quick break here. We're halfway through the show. When we come back, we're going to talk about the right to confidentiality. Back in a minute.
Are you suffering from IRS problems? Do you owe back taxes you can't pay? Is your paycheck or bank account being levied? Or maybe you haven't filed tax returns in years and simply don't know what to do. This is Darrin T. Mish to tell you that if you're tired of IRS problems hanging over your head and are ready for a fresh start, we may be able to help. Call the law offices of Darrin T. Mish at 888-GET-MISH, 888-GET-MISH. I can help you file old tax returns, work to release tax liens or stop wage levies, even negotiate deals to pay off back taxes at a discount, sometimes for pennies on the dollar. Hey, let's face it, these days it's not hard to get into tax trouble. A divorce, failed business, health problems, you name it. The point is, IRS problems may be solved if you're willing to take the first step. Call for a free consultation at 888-GET-MISH. That's 888-438-6474. Or go to the web at getirshelp.com, because the one sure thing is, IRS problems don't solve themselves. So get Mish. 888-438-6474. Principal Office, Tampa.
Welcome back, and you're listening to the IRS Solution Attorney Show. Thank you for sticking with us this morning and sticking with us through the break.
I am the IRS Solution Attorney, Darrin T. Mish.
And I'm your co-host, Katrina Madewell. On today's show, we've been promising you for a long while, but we're actually talking about what your rights are as a taxpayer.
And so we talked about a number of them so far, but to recap quickly, we'll just go ahead and go over them again. You have the right to be informed. You have the right to quality service. Chuckle, chuckle. The right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax. The right to challenge the IRS's position and be heard. The right to appeal an IRS decision in an independent forum, the right to finality, and the right to privacy. We've covered all those so far today in today's show.
And then confidentiality, you would think that would kind of go hand in hand with privacy.
Yeah, I was going to say the next one is the right to confidentiality, and that's really packed in there with privacy, right? I mean, taxpayers have the right to expect that any information they provide to the IRS will not be disclosed unless authorized by the taxpayer or by law. Taxpayers have the right to expect appropriate action will be taken against employees, return preparers, and others who wrongfully use or disclose taxpayer return information. So this thing kind of has two things going on in it. It says the IRS is not going to give out your personal information to people who don't deserve it.
Yeah, they're going to take action against employees.
But we're also going to pop people who steal your identification, your identifying information. And use
Which that doesn't happen. That goes in the back burner.
It totally doesn't happen. And that's kind of the criticism I'm about to levy here is that, ID theft in the tax system is just rampant, and it's particularly bad in the Tampa Bay area. And all the IRS really does is they do like this pro forma investigation that usually takes a year or a year and a half, where they just freeze taxpayers' account for that particular year. And then they do nothing about tracking down the people who actually perpetrated the fraud. I've heard stories in the Tampa Bay area of we had these rings of people who used to be drug dealers who realized that dealing drugs was like dangerous and risky, and that stealing people's Social Security numbers and filing false returns was like easy money.
You would think if they took money from the government, especially via like a fake tax returns, that would be on it. Like I would think that's like poking a bear with a stick or whacking the hornet's nest.
I have a buddy who's actually a Tampa police detective, and he's in like auto theft, and he tells me this story. So they got this guy, Pookie, and Pookie's driving around in a chromed car. Like, the whole car was chromed. Okay, this is expensive, and it's very flashy, obviously. And he's like in a low-income neighborhood, and they think he's a drug dealer. And so they're trying to figure out like where Pookie's getting his money, and that he's under surveillance, and they can't find Pookie doing anything wrong. Like, he's not doing drugs. He's not like hanging out the street corners. They can't figure out what he's doing. He's not engaged in any drug activity at all. And so finally they figure out like he's got a busted taillight or something, and they pull him over. It's probably a pretext stop, which means they probably shouldn't have stopped him. And they pull him over, and they find the car is full of IRS refund checks. So Pookie wasn't dealing drugs. Pookie wasn't stealing cars. Pookie was defrauding the IRS. Now, this isn't even the best part of the story. So TPD goes to the IRS. Hey, we got Pookie with a car full of fraudulent IRS refund checks. What are you going to do about it? IRS says, oh, well, that would violate his right to confidentiality and privacy. So we're not going to do anything.
What?
So they do nothing.
The other thing we see, too, like, on my end, and you'll probably know more about some of these things, but, like, literally something will happen, like, the person lives here in Florida, but then the crime will be committed somewhere else in another state, and then they're constantly doing like this, where they're pointing the fingers at each other, going, well, I'm not responsible, call New York Police Department, or call California, or call somewhere else.
I had a credit card ID theft problem. I've probably talked about it on the show before, where somebody stole my identity and opened up a charge card at a computer company. And I had never done business with the computer company. I get this statement for $7,000 or $8,000, and I call the computer company. Hey, man, I don't know what this is, but I didn't spend this money. And they treat me like I'm lying. And we boil it down to like 7 or 8 computers were delivered to someplace in the Bronx. Well, up to that point, I have still never been to the Bronx ever. And so I spent an awful lot of my own time getting that unpacked so that I don't owe the money to the computer company, the charge card company. But then I want something to be done. So I call Tampa Police. They tell me maybe call the sheriff's office. So I call the sheriff's office. They say, well, call New York. I call NYPD. How do you think that went over?
Oh, yeah.
So I call it
Even worse than Tampa.
I called NYPD. They're like, call the FBI. I call the FBI.
Yeah.
FBI guy's cool as heck. And he's like, yeah, but sorry. Like, this is going on all over the place. I call the Secret Service. He's just as cool as the FBI. Secret Service handles credit card fraud, by the way. And they're all real nice to me, but they all say, look, man,
Low on the totem pole.
ain't nothing going to happen. So, yeah, I mean, talk about jurisdictional runaround. I think I talked to 5 or 6 different law enforcement agencies, and they all told me, like, whatever. Like, the bank's the victim here, not you.
But then do you find, too, that nobody wants to take the police report?
I got somebody to take the police report. I think I got local law enforcement.
But they don't want to do it. They're like trying to point you to New York, and New York's
but
like,
they didn't do anything about it. And I didn't ultimately have any loss because I didn't have to pay for it. My loss was actually in the time I spent. Mm-hmm. And it was a lot. It was like probably 20 hours before it was all done.
And this one shouldn't be a surprise, but you have the right to retain representation.
This is my favorite one on this list. The right to retain representation. So taxpayers have the right to retain an authorized representative of their choice to represent them in their dealings with the IRS. Taxpayers have the right to seek assistance from a low-income taxpayer clinic if they cannot afford representation. Okay, we're going to ignore that second part. Probably doesn't apply to most people. You have the right to retain an authorized representative of your choice. Okay, this is sort of true and untrue. Okay, so like you couldn't represent me because you don't have the right professional credential. Now I can represent you because I do have the appropriate credential. So it's not like, what if I wanted you to represent me?
Not authorized. Sorry.
Well, you're authorized by me.
Not authorized,
but you're not authorized by them. So here's what this really means: is you can hire or retain an attorney licensed in any state, a CPA licensed in any state, or an enrolled agent, which is a federally licensed, basically tax accountant that's licensed in all states by the federal government to represent taxpayers. So those are the 3 types of representatives. Now, sometimes husbands and wives can represent each other, and sometimes parents can represent their kids and things like that. But the limitations are pretty skinny. But you do have the right to retain representation, and that's a constitutional right, by the way. And also, the money that you spend on representation is an allowable expense.
I gotta love that one.
Yeah, that part I really like, too.
So, real quick, I know it's off topic, so we won't spend a lot of time here, but talking about an attorney to a CPA to an enrolled agent. What's the pros, cons, benefits in hiring one of those?
Okay.
Individually.
So I'm gonna commit some stereotypes here. Okay. CPAs are going to try and solve every tax problem by doing the math better. Okay, literally, CPAs are accountants. They're very black and white people. They're going to try.
On the DISC personality profile, they're the C off the chain.
Yeah, they're going to try and sharpen the pencil, and they're going to try and fix it with the math. Okay, this is not a knock on them. And some guys are really good at fixing the math. Now, a lawyer is not, unless you get there are some combined CPA attorneys, but I'm not a CPA. I'm just an attorney. Okay, so here's what that means. I was trained differently than a CPA. I have a CPA who works with me in my firm, and if we have to attack the numbers, that's going to be his job, like his part of my job. But I'm always going to try to attack the procedural aspects of the case. If you ask me what 2 plus 2 is, the CPA is going to say 4, and that's going to be the end of the discussion. You ask me what 2 plus 2 is, I'm going to say, well, what do we need it to be?
How'd you get there?
It might be 3.8. It might be 4.2. I don't know. It's like, where do we need to go? So that's going to be the biggest difference. And that lawyers are taught advocacy in law school and then subsequently in practice. I mean, our ethical duty is to be a zealous advocate. A CPA has no corresponding duty, in my understanding.
And so where does the enrolled agent play a part in that? An
enrolled agent is going to be more on the accountant side of this thing. And then a lot of enrolled agents. Is it true that
they're all like ex-IRS employees?
I was going to say some enrolled agents get the credential because they've taken a test. And some enrolled agents get the credential because they've just spent X number of time working for the IRS.
You think there's a benefit in that? Like they know the inside scoop? He's shaking his head no.
They might know the inside scoop, but most of retired IRS employees who become enrolled agents and represent taxpayers that I've come into contact with, what I have heard is that they tend to be extremely conservative and extremely pro-government. Now, does this surprise you?
We get a retirement check from the government.
Yeah, they're on a pension from the government. They worked in the IRS for 20 or 30 years, beating up taxpayers, and then you think they're going to put on a new hat and all of a sudden beat up the IRS? It just ain't going to happen. I'm sorry. It's just not going to happen. And I do know some revenue officers here in the area who've retired and now they represent taxpayers, and that's pretty much accurate as far as my understanding. Is they're pretty much pro-government hacks, and they don't really have their finger on the pulse of what kind of offers are going through, for example.
Right.
Because they don't know.
They're out of the loop.
They weren't exposed to that when they were working, and so, because they weren't handling offers back then.
And so the last one on our list is the right to a fair and just tax system.
Okay, so this is violated every single day. Taxpayers have the right to expect the tax system to consider facts and circumstances that might affect their underlying tax liabilities, their ability to pay, or ability to provide information timely. Taxpayers have the right to receive assistance from the Taxpayer Advocate Service if they're experiencing financial difficulty, or if the IRS has not resolved their tax issues properly and timely through its normal channels.
That's debatable.
I think that with counsel, the IRS system is somewhat fair and just. Somewhat. I see a lot of injustice. Just last week or the week before, we talked about how I had the client who had the accepted offer and compromise, and then they paid, and they paid within their time allotted, and then the IRS said they didn't pay, and I sent them a letter, and I showed them exactly where they paid and how they paid, and they paid on time, and then they still terminated the installment agreement or the offer and compromise and made it all come back due because they had done it, they internally had screwed up. I don't think that's fair or just. And so, there's an example right there. You in that case, you need counsel to fix that.
Right. So Matt wants to know, what if you feel like, your rights as a taxpayer has been violated with some of these things we've been chatting about?
Well, good luck with that, Matt. If your rights of a taxpayer have been violated, probably 9 times out of 10, all you're going to be able to do is try and use the right proper procedure to kind of steer the case back in the right direction. Now, if you think your rights have really been violated, like a revenue officer has threatened you with prison or something that's really egregious or violation,
which you're not allowed to do.
They're not allowed to do. Then you can actually go to what's called TIGTA, T-I-G-T-A. It stands for Taxpayer Treasury. Anyway, it's basically internal affairs for the IRS.
Somebody asked me about Tread the other day.
Yeah, it's TIGTA.
Yeah.
And you can make a formal complaint against an IRS employee with TIGTA, and they're supposed to investigate it and prosecute it if necessary. And I like the TIGTA guys. They're studs. And, I've gone to lunch with them and stuff like that. And they're really good. They have a weird mission. They have a twofold mission. They're internal affairs for the IRS, and they're also like the Secret Service for IRS. So they have like this love-hate tension with IRS employees.
I bet. All right, Andy, to answer your question really quick, yes, Darrin helps people in Georgia. We have to take a break because we're at the end of our segment. You're listening to the IRS Solution Attorney. We'll have Darrin comment on that when we get back, and also talk about a couple of things we didn't get to last week and the train wreck of the week. Back in a minute. Welcome back. Thanks for listening to the IRS Solution Attorney Show. We're glad to have you with us today.
Yes, we are. As the IRS Solution Attorney, I am pleased that you're listening.
And we hope you got some value out of today's show. We're talking about your rights as a taxpayer.
We went through a whole bunch of your rights as a taxpayer, and I don't think we're going to recap them here.
But you can get the whole thing in its entirety on a podcast.
You can. It's actually been officially changed, the name of the podcast, to the IRS Solution Attorney, as has our app has been changed to the IRS Solution Attorney as well.
Look at that. We're consistent. I love it.
You can follow us on Facebook at the IRS Solution Attorney or on Twitter at Darrin_Mish. You can visit my website at getirshelp.com as well. Our phone number there at the office is 888-GET-MISH. That's 888-438-6474. One of the things, I think the overarching, I mean, we went over all the rights as a taxpayer today, right?
And there was a lot of them.
And one of the things that we learned, or that I at least commented on, was a lot of these things are sort of broken. Like it's not exactly working out the way it's supposed to. But does that surprise us? I mean, does government do anything really all that well? And it's not surprising that government's not like enforcing taxpayer rights all that well. But the good news is that these were imposed after 1998, and, it's going okay, I guess. Prior to 1998, you didn't even have these rights as a taxpayer, and they pretty much did whatever they wanted.
So people like you weren't really employed in this field, is that what you're saying back then?
Well, there was just a lot less we could do. I mean, you couldn't really appeal, and revenue officers would just go and seize your stuff just to punish you.
Just because.
Yeah, and so there was a big reform in 1998, and there was hearings before Congress, and they tried to get the IRS under wraps a little bit.
So I know we're hopping around, and we ran out of time on last week's show, but we did have a couple of questions. I answered the ones. Do you want to tag or say anything else on Andy's? He wanted to know if you're licensed to help clients in Georgia.
I get this question an awful lot, and I really like the question, and here's why. As I alluded to in the third segment of the show, an attorney licensed in any state can represent taxpayers in any state. So I have clients from all 50 states. I've represented clients from U.S. Taxpayers all around the world. And
except for Antarctica.
Except
Am I
for
right?
Antarctica. And right now I can think of clients that I have in California, Washington State, too many in Texas to list, just all over the place.
So we had a couple questions from last week we didn't get to. John wanted to know, if income tax was determined to be unconstitutional, is there any chance of that happening again? Remember we talked about that last week?
Yeah, I think his question is there any chance that income tax could be determined to be unconstitutional? I think it's very unlikely that it would be considered unconstitutional, and let me tell you why. The system is so big now, and there's so many people who get paid from the U.S. Treasury. How in the world would they pay all those people if they determined that the federal income tax was unconstitutional? I think there's some decent arguments that I won't go into that it is unconstitutional. But I think now we have this bloated, just huge government that if you were to say that it's unconstitutional, we're no longer going to collect income tax. I don't know how you feed that beast.
Well, Kathy's question is pretty spot on too, but she wanted to know, does she have to pay her family's Obamacare tax now that Trump is in office?
Well, Trump hasn't. I'm not sure. Well, anyway,
at this very moment in time,
once Trump takes office, that's Obamacare is not going to be overturned immediately. Okay. Now, what's likely to happen if Obamacare is overturned is there's going to be some provision for either the forgiveness of the penalties that have been imposed in the past or not. Who knows?
Remains to be seen at this point. It's an interesting question, Kathy, but I think it's one we can't answer yet.
We don't know. And most people's ACA penalties are not that significant. But if yours is, I mean, well, I guess you're going to have to wait and see.
Should we talk about the IRS announcing 2017 mileage rates?
Well, just generally speaking, they've announced the new mileage rates, and it looks like they're actually going down, which is kind of bizarro.
So they're going to pay less?
Yeah, they're going to pay less. Gas prices are less and have been less for a while now.
I don't like that one.
Yeah, it's not great, but it is kind of fair. I mean, gas prices are, $2.25, $2.50, something like that. And in years past, they've been as high as like $4.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like, that's when the whole Prius.
Higher if you live out in California or places like that.
About that time?
It's about that time. It's time for the IRS train wreck of the week. This is the segment of the show when we talk about somebody who came in and they're frankly just kind of a train wreck. They had a big IRS problem. Ultimately, we had to bring them in the fold, put our protective arms around them, figure out what the answer was.
Give them a hug and a kiss.
What their solution was to their mess that they had created. Believe it or not, I'm a big proponent of personal responsibility. And even though I can be an enabler in a way, right? Because I help to alleviate them of their personal responsibility. But the best clients are the people who kind of come in and they go, yeah, I really screwed this up. I mean, this is all my fault. I did these things wrong, and I want to do what I can, what's right, to remedy this situation now. In this case, and I've talked about this case in general before, it's an elderly dentist. I believe he's in his 80s now. And I represented he and his wife off and on for 10 or more years. They were retired, and they didn't have a lot of money. They owed a lot of tax debt at the time. And you could just see the writing on the wall. I mean, they had properties up in Michigan. Like, he had his old dental practice building up in Michigan. He had a big house up in Michigan, and they were living down here in Florida, like in the villages or something like that. Oh, yeah. And they just couldn't support the lifestyle that they had when he was practicing, which I think makes perfect sense, right? And so for 10 plus years, I was giving them advice. Here's what you need to do. We have to solve this. And
they weren't listening.
They'd pay me, and they would never implement any of the advice. And this went on and on and on. And I almost got to the point where I almost dropped them because it was just...
I can't help you.
It just bothered me because you're just wasting your money with me, and you're just wasting your money with me, and we're not solving this problem. And it really was tearing at me. And ultimately, Mrs. has since died, which is really sad because she passed away, and this was still a big mess.
Is this when he finally decided to do something?
And finally, I mean, he's well into his 80s. He has to have a caretaker, like, bring him places and stuff. And finally, we decided to file an offer in compromise. Now, we had already filed some bankruptcies and really whittled this thing down. He still owed $53,944. I mean, he has no ability to earn. He's got a small pension. He's got some Social Security, and he just really doesn't have any assets left.
So let me ask a dumb question. Why is he even dealing with it at this phase in his life?
Well, there's two answers. Number one, because it was still bugging him, and the IRS was still trying to collect, and he had some nominal ability to pay back, according to them, at least initially. And the real reason is because he didn't deal with it back before. When I was telling him how to do it before, he just wouldn't do it. He just would not implement any of my reasonable advice.
So I take it they were pounding down on him, and he said, fine.
And this went on for 10, 12, 15 years. I mean, I know this guy forever. And ultimately, we filed an offer in compromise. We offered $1,479. When we did the math, that's what it came out to be, $1,479 on $54,000, give or take. And this was a rare case because when I filed the offer, waited about a year, offer examiner called me up and said, I'm going to recommend this be accepted as filed. And ultimately, that's what happened. So they settled for less than $1,500 on $54,000. The saddest part of the story is Mrs. died while this was all pending. And I mean, the great news is that finally, after all these years, it's finally going to be put behind them.
I'd have to get that monkey off my back a lot sooner than that. I'm just saying.
Yeah, he's kind of a slow learner. Beautiful man. Love the guy. Kind of a slow learner.
Well, thank you for joining us today. You're listening to the IRS Solution Attorney Show. If you need Darrin's help or you know someone that does, you can get him at 888-GET-MISH.
888-438-6474.
Again, 888-GET-MISH. Thanks for joining us today. We're glad to have you join in next week.
For today, we're out.